So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the session today. I am Shannon Jones, and I will be moderating the session. It's my pleasure to welcome Christie Peters, who will present Becoming a Neuroinclusive Manager, Moving Beyond Awareness. Before we get started this afternoon, I want to go over a few logistical items with you. This session is being recorded. Captions are available during this session by clicking on the Live CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Thanks to Javier Saavedra for providing these. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. You can choose to do so anonymously. There will be a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Also, please use the chat for any general comments or technical issues you may be experiencing during the session today. Joanna Kimmett, I'm sorry, Bob, Billy Cotterman will be monitoring the chat for any questions and comments. Billy will also be adding some links into the chat. One is for our collaborative resource sharing. So if you while Christy is presenting, if you think of a related reading, a podcast, a video, or something else that you want to share with all of the participants, please add it to our recommended resources shared Zotero. The next link that you're going to see is for the conference code of conduct. And so if you have not had an opportunity to visit that document, please take a moment to review it just so that you know what you need to do in the event that that there's an incident during the session, or if you need to get in contact with one of the conference organizers. And with that, I am going to turn the mic over to Christy. The floor is all yours,
Okay.
Christy.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can you see that, Shannon?
Yeah, yes, it's
Okay. Okay.
fine
Just
on my
making
end.
sure.
No, we're good.
You never know. Okay. Oop. Look, I gave away my surprise. All right. So thank you, everyone. I am Christie Peters, as you know. I am very excited to be here today. Thus my color bomb. Let's see, let's get it in its full glory here. And I'm excited because this is the first time I have presented on this topic. Sorry, my color bomb is a little glitchy. Anyway, I'm excited to present on this topic because I am neurodiverse. I have ADHD. As you can see next to my name, I have ADHD next to my gender pronouns, she, her. I saw this for the first time on YouTube. I have been watching a lot of neurodiversity YouTube. And many of the presenters identify themselves this way, and I think it's a great idea. So I'm going to tell you, let's see if I can get past, yes, the color bond. So I said I would introduce myself this morning because my introduction will include the reason why I really consider my neurodiversity identity or my neurodistinction is really interwoven with my professional identity. So I don't feel like I can really present on this topic without sharing why this is so important to me right now. So I became an academic librarian for the first time at the University of Houston in 2009 as a science and engineering librarian. At that time, I did not know that I had ADHD. And I want to say around 2011, very dear friends of mine and colleagues who are leaders and managers in their own right today began to suggest that I might have ADHD. It didn't come as a tremendous surprise at the time, but they were like, you think a little differently than some people. You go about your work a little differently than some people. So I decided to get it checked out. And I did, in fact, turn out to be ADHD. So in 2015, I moved to the University of Kentucky, where I was head of the Science and Engineering Library. And while I knew I had ADHD, I didn't really feel like it affected my work. I think the self-awareness did help me be a better manager just in how I relate to people. But I didn't encounter any real challenges that I attributed to my ADHD. In 2019, a mere 6 months before COVID times, I moved to St. Louis, where I am currently head of our Area Studies, Social Sciences, and Humanities team. And things were going okay, right? It was October. I was in a new job. Things were great. And then COVID times happened, right? Which changed everything for everybody. I will be the first to acknowledge that COVID had a really seriously detrimental effect on everyone's mental health in the world, whether they are neurodistinct or not. But for me, when we started working from home, when you're ADHD and your brain never turns off, working from home means living at work, right? And nobody knew how to really coach anyone on how to work from home because it was new to all of us. But for a year and a half, I basically worked all the time. I worked nights, weekends, holidays, vacations. Nobody told me I had to, but I was living at work, right? And I really just didn't know how to manage, separating work and home for that time. So in, I want to say very early fall, like the beginning of the fall semester in 2021, I did in fact crash and burn. I had people telling me prior to that time, you cannot continue working at the pace that you're working without there being some sort of, fallout. And it did happen. I have never been a particularly prone to sickness person, but I was in and out of the ER. I was in and out of doctor's offices. I ended up being hospitalized for 3 days at the end of November. I took FMLA for the entire month of December, feeling very guilty about that, right? Because I think it's probably not unusual for people who work in a service industry like we do to, we're better at focusing on other people than we are on ourselves. And that was certainly the case for me. But even being out for the entire month of December, I still really think I went back to work too soon. I was in treatment through August, I want to say, of 2022. And, physically and mentally, I should have stayed out longer to take care of myself, and I did not do that. So, that year from fall of 21 till I want to say summer of 22, I was really literally just trying to survive. And that is really what made me start thinking that this is such an important topic. And I think I have something to offer, and, I plan on doing a lot more work in this space, but this is the first presentation for me on this topic. And yeah, the first time I have ever publicly talked about my ADHD, my neurodiversity on such a public stage. So it is very exciting for me to be here. So before I really get into the presentation, Before COM sent out the brief for presenters to sort of reflect on land acknowledgements at their university or in their library, I was planning to ask everyone to take a moment, to just breathe something I have to really be intentional about, to breathe, to reflect on what you are hoping to get out of this session and out of this conference. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to read the statement to you. I am going to give us a minute. If you have time after you read the statement, before the minute is up, I do recommend to you that you take the remainder of the moment to just, focus and breathe. And I will speak a few words about this afterwards. Okay, your minute starts now. Okay. So hopefully that helped you the way it does me. So what I will say about this statement, it was written, as you can see, by the Booter Center for American Indian Studies at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. I want to say maybe a couple of years ago, maybe not quite that long. When they released this statement, they did hold a virtual discussion with anyone who wanted to come. And I attended that discussion with two of my colleagues. The three of us met afterwards to sort of talk about what we had learned, to see if we think this is something we could use, if we think it maybe should be modified. I do believe we think we would probably want to modify it somehow, but we're not sure how. We really would like to talk to the people at the Booter Center. The law school on WashU campus did just take it wholesale. They just replaced the Brown School with the law school, which is fine for them. We're just not sure that's exactly right for us. So that's really all I have to say about it. We have thought about it, but we haven't really made any movement on it yet. Okay, so let me see if I can get a fuller view of my screen. I do have quite a few things I want to talk to you about today. I am going to give you a few key takeaways at the very beginning of the presentation, because I feel like sometimes those types of takeaways get lost over the course of a presentation, lost in the shuffle. I will spend some time defining neurodiversity and talking a little bit about what neurodiversity is, because I think that's essential for any organization that is going to become more neuroinclusive. You have to have that basic understanding. I will also talk about discrimination and stigma. If the folks who presented on the bullying and incivility session on Monday are here, you are going to hear some things that resonate with you. I'm very glad that I got to see your presentation because, neurodiversity and disability and just difference in general, does lead to discrimination and stigma, and that can lead to bullying and incivility. I'll talk a little bit about common barriers and recommendations, primarily communication, because while neurodiverse employees, face a number of challenges in the workplace, many of them, sort of revolve around communication and misunderstanding. Organizational climate, I won't spend a lot of time there, but I will distinguish diversity, inclusion, and organizational justice climates. And then the stages of employment recommendations, they are pretty text-heavy slides, which, I apologize for, but I did promise some recommendations. They are not intended to be exhaustive, simply to get you started thinking about the kinds of changes that you can make to help your organization become more neuroinclusive. And as I said to Shannon before the session started, really, the more I have worked on this presentation, the more I think it really should have been called Becoming a Neuroinclusive Organization, more than manager, because individual managers can certainly make a difference for the people on their teams. But for the scale of change that we need in academic libraries to become more inclusive, it really has to be taken up, a notch to a more organizational context. Okay, so key takeaways. I'm not going to explain these yet, but if you have questions after the presentation about any of these key takeaways, please let me know. All right, neurodiversity is an invisible disability, in quotes, compounded by intersectionality. To be truly neuroinclusive, you must assume that all employees are neurodistinct. I will use neurodiverse and neurodistinct interchangeably. The only thing I advise strongly against is using the word neurodivergent, because divergence has more of a negative connotation to it. Training on neuroinclusion for all employees, included targeted training for managers, is essential. For neuroinclusion, equity equals accommodation. I cannot emphasize that enough, and you will hear it again before this presentation is over. Equity equals accommodation. And lastly, your leadership matters. This requires systemic change. This requires organization level change. And I think the leadership of everyone matters, whether you consider yourself neurodistinct or not. But I would say that if you are neurodistinct, you don't have to get up in front of hundreds of people and tell them about it, but let your people know, let the people in your organization know. I feel like a lot of people have the idea that, like, we don't understand, why wouldn't our employees disclose that they're neurodiverse to us? That is because there is so much stigma and discrimination societally around cognitive difference, around neurodiversity. So, I will certainly never be shy about sharing my neurodiversity again, because I feel like we have an opportunity to stand up and say, I have been successful in this profession, in academic libraries, perhaps not in spite of my neurodiversity, but because of it, and sure, it was hard, and there will continue to be challenges because I will always be ADHD, but I made it, and you can make it too. And I want to help you get there. Our employees need for us to be as visible and open about neurodiversity as we expect them to be. So that's my main soapbox for this presentation. I don't know, there might be one more in here, but I really want to emphasize that fact. All right, so when I'm looking at neurodiversity in the DEIB framework, in terms of diversity, I'm talking about cognitive function, how people think differently and behave differently based on those thoughts. Equity equals accommodation. I'm going to say it again. Inclusion means acceptance. Inclusion for a neurodiverse employee does not mean hiring a neurodiverse individual and saying, you can be successful here if you do everything exactly the same way everybody else does. That is not acceptance. Acceptance is bringing in a neurodiverse employee and saying, we all are unique in this organization. We all have our differences, and you can be successful here as you are with support from, your manager and leadership within the organization. That is acceptance. And belonging, organizational affinity and well-being, I think many of us wish that there was a greater level of organizational affinity and well-being within our libraries, irrespective of neurodiversity. And, I will say here that most of the suggestions, if not all the suggestions I am going to talk about today, would be beneficial to everyone, whether they identify as neurodiverse or not. So to define neurodiversity, again, it's really just sort of the range of differences in individual brain function, as you can see here, how people process information, how they, behavioral traits that fall outside of cultural norms. What I really want to emphasize here is that there are no defined cultural norms about what normal brain function, information processing, and behavioral traits are. It's really impossible to define. Neurodiversity is really talking about everybody, right? Across the spectrum of brain function and all associated pieces of it. But you may hear me use, and if you watch neurodiversity YouTube or read about this, you may hear the term neurotypical. So neurotypical is, the opposite. It's what is expected or what we associate with normal ways of thinking and being. But again, it's really it's impossible really to define what normal looks like. So intersectionality, I do really feel like it's important for me to mention the importance of intersectionality. So in the late 90s, stemming largely from the autism movement that was happening at the time, the term neurodiversity was created as a way to, allow neurodiverse individuals to be on this intersectionality framework, but pull it out from under the umbrella of disability. It is certainly true that there are many neurodiverse individuals who have disabilities. That is a fact. But there are many people who consider themselves neurotypical who have disabilities as well. Disability and neurodiversity, they are not synonymous. So it is really important to remember that. It's also important to know that each individual's identity, which there can be an infinite, array of identities that combine to determine how you are in the world, right? I know that, very simplistically, males present neurodiversity very differently from females, right? Females are much better from a very young age at masking their neurodiverse traits, right? At fitting in to sort of their neurotypical counterparts world. So many girls aren't diagnosed as ADHD. I was over 40 years old when I was diagnosed as ADHD. And when you add, race and ethnicity, gender, class to your identity, it really compounds the effects that neurodiversity will have on your life, your personal life, your professional life, all aspects of your life. So that is very important to remember. Comorbidity is also important. Very few neurodiverse individuals are identified as having only one of these conditions, right? A huge percentage of autistic individuals also present with ADHD. I was shocked to learn that as many as 50% of people with ADHD have dyslexia. I had no idea. Anxiety and depression can certainly present in anyone, whether they identify as neurodistinct or not. But I would say that the experiences that neurodiverse people have as they go through their life can certainly increase the likelihood and the severity of depression and anxiety that they experience. So these terms, it's useful to see that there are a variety of conditions that will sort of fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, but individually they're meaningless because you can't say a person with ADHD is always going to be this way or think this way. Those terms, I put them here to acknowledge that they exist, but they can't really be used to make decisions about how you work with people. All right, so I'm going to talk about two models of disability. The medical model is what we currently really operate under, at least organizationally. And this stems from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which does protect individuals with mental illness, right? It doesn't talk about neurodiversity outside of that pathologizing deficit sort of model, right? The focus is on disability within the individual. So the goal is really to fix the individual. In an organizational context, that would be, trying to have the neurodiverse individual fit in with current organizational culture and ways of doing things. And I put executive function here because, there is a lot of research that does demonstrate that neurodiverse individuals have challenges with some executive functions. But I have put this here because I do think that is a very deficit way of looking at things, because people who consider themselves neurotypical can have problems with some of these executive functions as well. There is no widely accepted list of executive functions. Every list you see is going to be different, and there are no accepted norms of what good executive function looks like. So, as with sort of the terms of individual conditions, sure, these are areas where some neurodiverse employees might need to work, but that is certainly only one part of the story, right? The social model really stems from the neurodiversity movement that I mentioned, began really, I think, in the late 90s. So this really focuses on neurodiversity as just a natural form of human variation and diversity. Different people think different ways, research, a lot of researchers have said, if there weren't evolutionary benefits, sorry, my phone is dinging. two different ways of thinking, then we would not all think so differently. It's a very strengths-based orientation. It distinguishes having a cognitive impairment with disability. You can have an impairment and a disability, but you can have an impairment without being disabled. I do not consider myself disabled. I have never formally claimed a disability for any of my academic library jobs. It doesn't mean I won't, but I never have. Because if you read the language of university affirmative action statements and equal employment opportunity statements, it is very heavily focused on mental illness, right? You are doing neurodiverse employees a favor by hiring them if they have a mental illness. And I don't identify with that. That's, we can't necessarily change what those statements are at the larger organizational level, but we can include our own language in our own statements at the library level. And that's what I think we really need to do if we want to become more neuroinclusive. So positive attributes at extra usual levels, extra credit if anybody out there gets the extra usual reference. This I have put under the social model of disability because I do think it is a more strengths-based way of looking at things. I will just give you two things to consider. So there are a lot of neurodiverse individuals who push back against the idea of superpowers, which I have done. I admit it. I have talked about superpowers I think I have that are associated with my ADHD. So one consideration is, or one argument against that is that when you focus so heavily on your strengths, it sets up a really difficult it sets a bar unreasonably high, perhaps, because if one person with ADHD, you think ADHD people have this superpower, not everybody with ADHD is going to be strong in the same areas, right? So if, at an organizational level, you're thinking about how you can work with people who say they have ADHD, not everybody is going to have the same strengths. So I cannot say every neurodiverse individual is going to be strong in all of these areas, but these are areas where neurodiverse individuals have been shown to have strengths. All right, so what time is it? Understanding discrimination and stigma. Discrimination, I think we're all pretty familiar with. Unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, but there are a couple of terms I want to share beyond that. Ableism is a little more common in popular culture. This is discrimination related to physical ability, right? You are going to preferentially hire a person who is able-bodied over someone who has mobility issues, for example. Saneism is less common in the literature. I've also heard it called mentalism. This is discrimination specifically related to neurological difference, right? So there is stigma around neurodiversity. I don't want to hire somebody that might be, let's see, I've got some words. Yeah, like needy, demanding, careless. Think about these words. I'm going to leave them here for a second. How many times have we, you get frustrated. If you're a manager, especially, you might have many direct reports. You've got all these other things to do. How many times, even if you don't say it out loud, have you thought? And if you've got other words you can add to this, like saneism language, I would love to hear them. we make snap decisions on people based on characteristics that are just inconvenient for us to deal with throughout our work life, right? So that is something that I want you to be mindful of. Now, this slide is maybe my most important slide because I think this happens pervasively in organizations everywhere. So reverse discrimination is the idea that when you provide an accommodation for an individual in an organization, that is perceived as preferential treatment by other people within an organization. How many times have you heard or acted on a request from someone who asked, maybe they didn't term it or call it an accommodation, but they asked for something that would make their work life better, help them work better. And you said, or somebody said, if we do that for you, we're going to have to do that for everybody, right? I mean, that is not uncommon at all. But what I want you to consider is that this reverse discrimination idea is effectively an anti-affirmative action stance. It is a stance where equity measures, because equity equals accommodation, are perceived as unfair. So this goes back to, if you assume all of your employees are neurodistinct, because you are never going to know for sure, then you have to be open to the idea of having sort of an accommodation default policy in your library, right? And I think it is, even if the reverse discrimination doesn't happen, I know for a fact that some leaders and organizations, our HR policies and practices are typically across the board, right? We're going to tell this team they all have to work in an open office space 5 days a week, 7.5 hours a day, no exceptions, right? That is indirect discrimination if a person has a protected status as a neurodiverse individual under the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is, in fact, hidden institutional discrimination, and I believe that it happens everywhere. I think it is pretty pervasive. Toxic positivity, I also want to spend a second on. So toxic positivity happens all the time. And it happens because people don't like to be uncomfortable. I want you to take a second and read through these statements. When you are working, so this I'm going to direct, this is important for everyone, I think, in an organization, but it's important especially for managers and leaders to think for a minute about, when you are sitting down one-on-one with your employees and they express a concern to you, or they tell you that they're stressed out about something, or they tell you that something is challenging, it is just instinctive, I think, for a lot of people to brush it off, right? Because you don't want to go into that uncomfortable territory. You don't want to hear about feelings. You don't want to hear about problems. I don't want to hear about the problem, just a solution. I don't know how many times I've heard that, not just at one organization either. If we want to be neuroinclusive and support a neurodiverse staff, we have got to listen to what those employees have to say, even if it makes us uncomfortable. All right, so this is really just an introduction to the term concealable stigmatized identity. And I'll talk for a second about the paradox of voluntary disclosure. I think many people, including neurodiverse individuals, realize that disclosing your neurodistinction is usually helpful, right? It helps relieve the pressure you're holding in. It helps people understand you better. The challenge with voluntary disclosure is that, individuals don't come into your organization straight from the womb, right? They come in with years and decades of lived experiences that have conditioned them to believe they are going to be discriminated against. So while sure, I think generally speaking, it is better to disclose, it is not surprising to me at all that so many neurodiverse individuals are scared to, because there are some real consequences for some people. I think this is why we really have to deal with this organizationally, right? We have to deal with this not just one person by one person. There has to be like a dedicated effort from the highest level of an organization to say, we are a neuroinclusive institution, and we are going to educate everyone at all levels with targeted training so they understand what is good practice and what is not. So concealable stigmatized identity, you will see that in the literature. It just indicates, that it is an invisible disability, as I said at the beginning. Oop, let's see if I can get past. All right, so I'm almost at it. Okay, so we can talk about these. I wanted to put them here so you've got them after the fact, but I really felt like it was more important to define neurodiversity and stigma than just read through some bullet points that without the context and without the knowledge really make no sense. So I've just got a few ideas here, personal physical spaces, light sensitivity, noise sensitivity. There are solutions that are, some of which are pretty simple in these cases. I know open offices plague businesses everywhere, but there are things you can do to sort of enclose a cubicle space. There are things you can do to help with light sensitivity. One article I read, had individual work pods distributed that any employees could use, right? And that gives people personal space as well. Communication barriers. I have 3 common types of barriers here. So misunderstanding verbal communication, we've got abstraction, nuance, the small talk. A general recommendation for communication barriers is to be direct, be intentional about what you say. Don't expect everyone to get the joke. Atypical nonverbal communication. This is important even like during the interview process. How many interviews, have you been in where you judged a person based on the fact that they don't make eye contact, or, their tone seems a little questionable? Like interrupting, directness. I'm an interrupter, you guys. Oh, it's like my biggest challenge in my work life. I do constantly work on it. I do not mean any disrespect. I just get so excited about all the things, right? But the conversely to that is not speaking up. You may assume someone is just being lazy or not paying attention when it is just not part of their communication style to be very verbal. And I've got some suggestions here that I can go back to in Q&A if you want. Organizational climate, diversity climate is really about representation. The issue is you cannot see the neurodiversity in your organization because it is invisible. So diversity climate isn't enough. Inclusion climate, all I really want to emphasize here is that neurodiverse employees should be included in discussions around becoming a neurodiverse organization. You know, we wouldn't dream of creating an anti-racism program without including BIPOC communities in that conversation. So, you know, I would say, I would assume that you would not work on a neuroinclusivity program without including neurodiverse employees. The challenge is you have to know who they are. And the only way you can do that is by being very overt about being a neuroinclusive organization. Organizational justice climate, we've got interpersonal justice, procedural justice. Do you have these policies written down? Distributive justice. Are you acting on those policies? Are you treating everyone equitably? Not equally, but equitably. I want you to read this statement for a minute. I am almost done, by the way. So how many of our HR policies allow this kind of agency on the part of a manager to exercise and extend moral agency? That's just not how those kinds of policies are typically written, right? So that is something I think organizational justice climate is something that all organizations really need to address. And then I think I'm gonna, did I go backwards? I did not mean to have my thumbs up video on the slide, but I do have some like job description recommendations. I've got interview recommendations, communication style survey and feedback preference survey for onboarding of all employees, I think is a really, really good idea. Setting employees up for success, performance management. You know, I do have some bullets here. They are not exhaustive. They are just to get you thinking. I had no intention of reading through them all for you, but I want you to see that they're here. A few reference books. The only ALA of all the 1,700 plus books in the ALA store, the only book I found that included chapters on mental health for employees and not for patrons is this book called Academic Librarian Burnout, Causes and Responses. It is a phenomenal book. There are a couple of chapters in here I highly recommend that everybody read. And then references I have broken down into some that are specific to neurodiversity, some to management and leadership. There are so many more, but I wanted to at least put the ones that I really referred to the most. I would love, if you are interested in working in this space, I would love to hear from you. But if you email me, I ask that you email me at my Gmail account, provocateurlibrarian@gmail.com. I have set up a Twitter as well. I have not done anything with it yet. These are new. I just wanted a dedicated place to do this work. So I will stop there. I don't know if I should stop sharing or.
Yeah, I mean, you can stop sharing if you want to, and then we'll I think we have about 8 minutes for questions, and so we'll get to as many of the questions as possible. And so
Sure.
I'll go ahead and start feeding them to you. The first one says, hearing you discuss your burnout and struggles during COVID really resonated with me. After starting a new job right before COVID and my mother being near death ill to go into COVID, a relationship upheaval, and to a new relationship to resulted in marriage and a new family. And I still don't feel like I have found my balance. I find myself in a near constant stage of paralysis with work. Do you have any suggestions for me in working with my supervisor, mentors, and therapists to help me find my way out, or is there more I need to consider?
It's hard work. I recommend, I wish I had the name of the chapter. There is a chapter in that academic library burnout book by Megan Toop, who I found out lives right here in St. Louis, and we have met. And it is the most painfully, bravely honest chapter I have ever read in my life. Like I was just speechless. And I will mention that is kind of related to this. One of the recommendations in training for search committees is to reconsider red flagging someone for having time off between jobs. How many times have we, looked at a CV and said, oh, there's this huge gap here. Well, maybe that huge gap is there because the person, for whatever reason, just literally needed to take time, because maybe they were burned out, maybe they had something going on, right? Like, I'm not saying, it isn't sometimes a red flag, but I do think that there are, like this person said, sometimes very good reasons for those gaps. You got to take care of yourself. And maybe taking time off is how some people need to do that. So
Okay,
I,
thank
I
you.
don't know if that was adequate answer, but there you go.
You can whoever asked that question, you can give some feedback in the chat box if that got at what you were asking. So the next question, it says, I am autistic and currently seeking an ADHD diagnosis as well.
Hmm.
What do you think we can do to make the interview process less stressful for neurodivergent individuals? What about providing interview questions beforehand as an accommodation?
So I'm so glad you asked a question. And I would love to talk, anybody, if anybody here in this room, wants to talk about this stuff, please reach out and let me know. I do have some recommendations in the interview section. Organizations in this country are required by law to accommodate during interviews. Do they always make that explicit in job postings or job announcements? I don't think so. And that information is not always very clearly available. But, you can certainly, I think more libraries are sending questions beforehand anyway, but I think that is very valid request. You can ask, libraries are the worst about, you have a candidate come in and meet with 5 groups of 5 to 50 people, right? That can be very anxiety inducing for some people. And I think it is very valid. And some of the recommendations I found in the literature was to ask that you do not have to meet with large groups of people. They recommend asking for things like skill-based sort of assessments over questions. Certainly, I know many libraries, you've got 30 minutes and we want you to answer 10 questions. Asking for more time to be able to articulate a response to those questions, that is a fair thing to ask for. So you definitely have power to ask for accommodations during the interview process, for sure. And bringing a job coach, legally, neurodiverse individuals are allowed to bring someone with them to the interview if that helps them. That does happen in some places. So you have options for sure.
And you all just make sure if you're looking at the Q&A box, there's some real good, some people providing answers
Yeah,
to that
that's
question
great.
too.
That's great.
Yeah,
I will get to see all the chats, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All
You
right.
will.
Okay.
Um, the next question, it says, disclosing neurodiversity can put a target on your back. What can you do if you are targeted after disclosing? can you be forced to submit an ADA accommodation?
I think it depends on whether or not you're asking for anything. I mean, if you're just disclosing because you want people to know, which is sort of how I've gone through my academic library life to date, I mean, I don't see why there would be any reason. An accommodation is to provide something that will help you, a resource or a practice or something different that's going to help you be successful. If you're not asking for anything, I don't know why you would have to formally disclose, but I do understand why some people are afraid. And when it relies on each manager's discretion, then it is hard to be able to say organizationally that we are neuroinclusive, right? That's why it really has to be like an organizational wide, top down, we have to say this out loud and we have to put it in writing that we are neuroinclusive and this is what that means for us, right?
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. Um, what to do about the fact that institutions really don't seem to include neurodiversity under their DEAI commitment, especially for the hiring process when institutions say they have a commitment to DEIA, so applicants feel compelled to identify their positional identities. And it feels like you are dinged for claiming
Keep
an
talking.
ND identity.
Here, there is, this was an example that I put on the job description slide. This company is an equal opportunity employer. We encourage qualified applicants from diverse backgrounds and experiences, including neurodiverse individuals, to apply. Accommodations are available. That is short and sweet and concise. And I think it says the important things, right? And it should be like up front and center. Like there is language we can, and you're right. I mean, at least presently at WashU, there is nothing that included in our DEI work for staff around neuro inclusion. The only formal language at the university level are like our affirmative action statement and equal employment opportunity statements, which are very, disability, mental illness, deficit kind of focused. I wish I could talk to you guys for like another hour. I'm sorry. I will
Yeah.
definitely be doing more of this stuff. So
Absolutely, because there are quite a few questions left with
I will
then
respond.
that
If I have a way to know who you are, I will try to send you a response to your question. Or you can email me at provocateur.librarian@gmail.com.
you want to put that in the
Sure, let me
chat
put it in the
box,
chat. That would be great.
and I'll get our session wrapped up, and then thank you for allowing people to reach out to you after the fact. So first of all, let's thank Christy for an amazing presentation, and
Yay.
um
I'm so
and
glad
for
it's over, you guys.
oh my goodness, no, you did your amazing job.
Although I would like to talk to you all more.
And
Okay. Oh, I
just
maybe
thank you for answering the questions too.
here, hang on a second. I sent the email to
Okay, so
the panelists.
and for everyone else, before we close today, just make sure that you complete the evaluation survey for the presentation. I'm sure Christy would welcome and appreciate any feedback you have to offer her.
Please
If you,
be honest too. Like I had videos and stuff. I know that's not good PowerPoint practice. So tell me if you hate it, if you love it, whatever.
yeah. And so your link, if you go back into Sketch, your link for the evaluation is in Sketch and is labeled feedback survey and is directly above the session description. So again, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Christy, for and helping us to increase our awareness of neurodiversity. And you all enjoy the rest of the conference and reach out to Christy if your question did not get answered. Please reach out to Christy and follow up and engage in dialogue because it is an important topic that we all need to continuously make sure that we are aware about and that we are doing something about to make sure that everybody in our libraries can be successful in doing their work and showing up as their authentic selves. So you all have a good afternoon, and again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you hang on just one second, Shannon?
Yes, yes.
Okay.